Nanabozho walked the land, handing out names to all he met, and Anishinaabe Linnaeus. I like to think of the two of them walking together. Linnaeus, the Swedish botanist and zoologist, in his loden jacket and woolen trousers, with felt hat cocked back on his forehead and a vasculum under his arm, and Nanabozho naked but for his breechcloth and a single feather, with a buckskin bag under his arm. They stroll along discussing the names for things. They're both so enthusiastic, pointing out the beautiful leaf shapes, the incomparable flowers. Linnaeus explains his Systema Naturae, a scheme designed to show the ways in which all things are related. Nanabozho nods enthusiastically. Yes, that is also our way. We say we are all related. He explains that there was a time when all beings spoke the same language and could understand one another, so all of creation knew each other's names. Linnaeus looks wistful about that. I ended up having to translate everything into Latin, he says, of binomial nomenclature. We lost any other common language long ago. Linnaeus lends Nanabozho his magnifying glass so he can see the tiny floral parts. Nanabozho gives Linnaeus a song so he can see their spirits, and neither of them are lonely.
Hello, and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time we have read Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Yeah, it was a pleasure for me rereading this book, and I know it was your first time reading it, so I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
It was my first time reading it, but you, did you first read it about 2 or 3 years ago now?
I think it was actually maybe a little over a year ago. Not too much over a year, because I think it was either a little before or a little after the pandemic got underway. Like, I think we're going to start timing things. So, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, right? Para-pandemic.
Exactly.
Because I remember reading it or continuing to be reading it because I read it over a long period of time the first time while I was planting stuff. And I remember that being a very kind of symbiotic process.
That makes sense. I also remember that you've been talking about it a lot ever since then. And, so now I finally have encountered this text that you were so very excited about.
I was, and I still am, I guess maybe in a slightly more thoughtful way, which is really it's a book that I did get very enthusiastic about. And it gave me a lot emotionally at a time when I really needed it. It was saying a lot of things I needed to hear. And that was really good. And it ended up being a kind of a gateway or an entryway into a lot of other things I read. And that's been wonderful. But I look at it now and I think to myself, I see its popularity and I see the people who are reading it and the ways they're reading it. And I'm like, I'm not taking away from the book at all, but I'm wondering I'm wondering what to make of the way people are responding to the book, the different ways people respond to the book and the different people that respond to the book. So I'd love to talk about that. And, it fits in with the kinds of issues that we're preoccupied with, like what makes a book, quote unquote, great? What does it mean to enter into a canon? What does it mean for a book to be representative of a kind of writing, right? Whether we're thinking about indigenous writers or we're thinking about the form of the essay or whatever, how does this book inhabit that space? I think that's so interesting.
Yeah, and this book first came out in 2013, so it's not even 10 years old yet, but it feels like a lot of people are just discovering it now.
Mm-hmm.
And several people I know have started reading it recently, unconnected to us or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to be wildly popular for particular audiences. And that's really interesting.
Well, it's partly about the book and it's partly about the moment, right? And by moment, I mean a couple of year time, but what is going on in the world that's making people attentive? I think part of it has to do with environment and climate. Part of it has to do with, and there's a lot to say about this, issues around indigenous sovereignty and the ways in which that plays out in the Canadian and American political environments in particular. And also people's sense of time and vulnerability and their desire for some way of being interconnected, which you can understand in a very positive way, but you can also understand it as being sometimes a little too easy to sort of see that as work that's done rather than work that has a long path ahead of it.
So we should probably explain a little bit about what the book is and what it's doing before we dive too deeply into what exactly it's doing well or how people have responded to it. It is a collection of essays, or it's a collection of chapters that mostly are structured as individual essays. And they're largely doing a few different things, I guess. They're providing information about indigenous thought, or some thoughts that are more or less shared with a lot of indigenous nations, about your relationship to the land, about humans' relationship to the land. So, for example, there's the idea of the reciprocity that one should feel towards the earth, that the earth provides you with food and shelter and all these wonderful gifts, and that you should give back to the earth as much as you receive, if not more. There's also the idea of the honorable harvest, this idea that when you're harvesting, when you're taking what you need, you should only take what you need. You don't need to take more than what you need. And you want to make sure that there's enough both for other people and also to let the earth, continue to thrive. So a lot of this might be, humans' relationship to the earth and to the plants and to the animals in indigenous thought 101, let's say. So that's one of the things that she's trying to introduce to the reader. Another thing is the connections between science. And when I say science, I think most people probably know what I mean by that. But like science as it's taught in universities, as it's done by accredited scientists, etc. The connections between that sense of science and indigenous teachings, things that indigenous nations have learned and shared with themselves and understood for centuries, and how these two things don't need to be at odds with each other. They can work very well, when they're connected to each other. She is a botanist. She's talking about plant life in particular. And so she'll tell the indigenous story, and then she might tell the scientific story about it as well. And these two stories often go together very well, even if she will also talk about how scientific communities can be resistant to listening to indigenous teachings. And the other thing that she's doing is, at least occasionally, telling her autobiography. A lot of this is her story, navigating these various worlds, raising her daughters, traveling to different parts of the country, talking to people from different communities, different nations, and how all of this has informed her and what we could all learn from this as well. So these three ideas sort of bounce off each other in different ways. They're so to speak, braided throughout the book.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about there being essays. It's essays and it's a collection of essays, but it's also structured in this very kind of sort of subtle way. I mean, it looks on the face of it like just a collection of essays, right? But as you say, there are through lines, particularly around her own personal narrative. And then there's sections, it's divided into 5 sections: planting sweetgrass, tending sweetgrass, picking sweetgrass, braiding sweetgrass, and burning sweetgrass. And on the one hand, this is all variations on the same thing, but it's also almost cyclical, right? You plant it, you tend it, you pick it, you braid it, you burn it. So there's a sense of almost a passage through time that's also a kind of a cycle of time, right? It might be an annual cycle even of growth and regeneration, right? So that's, I think, a really neat structure. And then the essays that are in each of the sections, there's about 5 to 8 in each section, they'll often kind of speak to one another across those sections. So on the one hand, there are essays, a genre we've talked about before, kind of stands on its own, but it's also kind of, I don't want to say braided, but it's interwoven in some kind of way. There's a structure that's very lightly worn.
Yeah, these all feel like essays that you could read independently,
but
for
sure.
It does not read like a collection of essays. It reads like there is a through line, an argument being made. It's telling the same stories and giving some of the same information again sometimes, but not in a way that feels redundant, not in a way that it feels like these two chapters don't know about each other. It's a very well written and very well put together book.
Yeah, I'm reminded of when we were reading Lee Miracle's work, right? And then also talking with her, different but the same, right? This idea that, you retell the same thing in different ways, depending on who's listening, depending on the particular context. And that's not redundant at all. That's just hearing what you need to hear in that particular setting. There's a little bit of that kind of thing going on here too.
Yeah. Well, so who is the author? Who is Robin Wall Kimmerer?
Well, one of the things I thought was interesting is getting ready for today, we always pull together little biographies based on what we can learn about different writers. And what I wanted to do is actually read what's on the back of the book, because it's so interesting in terms of positionality, both how the author's positioning herself, presumably how her publisher is kind of inflecting that, and how she's being received, because it really speaks to what we were just discussing, why has this book become so important to so many people? So, Robin Wall Kimmerer is a mother, scientist, decorated professor, and enrolled member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation. Her first book, Gathering Moss, was awarded the John Burroughs Medal for Outstanding Nature Writing. Her writings have appeared in Orion, O Magazine, and numerous scientific journals. She lives in Fabius, New York, where she's SUNY Distinguished Teaching Professor of Environmental Biology and the founder and director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment. So that's a regular kind of bio, right? But it's interesting, the positionality. Mother, scientist, professor, and member of the Potawatomi Nation. So this idea of like the domestic role and the role as a scientist being right up against each other, you don't see that all the time. And the role of being a teacher, right, being something that's being really highlighted. And where her writings have appeared, right, like scientific journals, but also O Magazine, right? So that's a certain, lady of a certain age demographic, right, that we're kind of talking about there, right? And I guess I noticed that because my sense of it is that Kimmerer's work is being received in two, probably more than two, but at least two distinct and both very important ways. One is in courses on indigenous studies, indigenous literature, indigeneity in the environment, and so on. Her book has been really important for a long time and fits into a whole kind of genealogy of writing about the natural world by First Nations and Indian writers, right? But there's also, and this is the more recent, I think, admiration for and love for her work in that book in particular. I mean, I don't want to call it a white lady phenomenon, but it is, I think, particularly women and women who are coming at it in a certain kind of way. And if you look at the blurbs on the back of the book, it's very telling. I don't want to say damning, right? But it's very telling. One of them is by Oren Lyons, who's a faith keeper of the Onondaga Nation and indigenous environmental leader, right? The other two are Jane Goodall, author of My Life with the Chimpanzees. And I have a lot of respect for Jane Goodall, but I'm just saying there's a particular note that's being struck by that. And then Elizabeth Gilbert, author of Eat, Pray, Love.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm like...
And Elizabeth Gilbert is the first of these.
Yes, I read them in reverse order. Exactly. So, I mean, I really don't want to be negative about that. I think it's good. And I think it's really positive that people are coming to this book, and it's the generousness of it and the beauty of the writing. The writing is beautiful. We're going to talk about this at some length, I'm sure. I want to recognize all that. And I want to recognize all the good things that book gives and the way which it brings you in potentially as a white person, right? Brings you into an environment that leads in a lot of very positive and fruitful directions. But it's also too easy sometimes, or it's too gentle sometimes, I think. Or can be read in a way that takes it as too gentle, and in a way that some of her other work is not. Like her book Gathering Mosses is not like that.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it doesn't let you off the hook quite so much, right? So it's a generous book, and I love that generous quality about it. But I also am like, this is an easy book to love.
So yes, I fully agree with that. This has been a really interesting book to read in comparison with the other indigenous writing that we've looked at with Lee Maracle and with Eden Robinson. This is a book that, unlike the other two, felt like it was written for a non-indigenous audience, and perhaps specifically for white people. But either way, it's a book that I feel like is aimed at me or people like me. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And we'll get into what the implications of that are, but I think there's also something to be thought about what the tactics of approaching an audience like that might be and where you want to get them. Where are your readers and where do you want to move them to? That's not going to necessarily get them into the ideal perfect end spot. I mean, if such a thing even exists. Mm-hmm. But if you're just trying to move them, if you're just trying to get them started on that journey, then you need to make certain decisions and compromises. And this book maybe does some of that.
You mentioned that, maybe it's written, at least this book is written at least in part, for a white audience or for a non-indigenous audience. And I think that's right. But I wouldn't want to lose sight of the fact that I think she also is speaking and has been heard by both those who are studying indigenous studies, right? Like who are themselves indigenous or non-indigenous, but also by indigenous persons. And I don't want to lose sight of that because there's a really interesting kind of history of response there too. I shared with you earlier, and I was so struck by this. It was a very eloquent Twitter thread by Dr. Zoe Todd, who is in environmental studies and sociology, really interesting scholar and writer. And she gave a long response to Braiding Sweetgrass and also Gathering Mosses, right? Like books that she teaches regularly, right? And she says, beautifully written, absolutely true, wildly popular with white readers. Right, that too. And she put it the way we were just discussing, a great entry point. Braiding Sweetgrass, she says, is a great entry point for non-indigenous folks to indigenous scholarship. But there's issues around that reception, that gentleness and friendliness we were talking about before. She says, white readers love indigenous work that's not threatening, right? And while there are moments in Braiding Sweetgrass that kind of are uncomfortable, like she does talk about displacement of Native Americans and First Nations. She does talk about residential schools. She talks about the terrible pollution and destruction of, the natural world through rampant capital. There are uncomfortable moments, but it's easy to just sort of slip past those, right? And so Zoe Todd says that the effect here is that it kind of flattens out what's going on to a kind of very simple, like, here's indigenous ways of knowing, here's settler ways of knowing. Wouldn't it be good if we could all kind of get together on the same ground? Like that there's a kind of, it can be read in a flattened way, and that's not great. And so she sums up by saying, and I think this is really smart, Braiding Sweetgrass is a beautiful book. I'll keep teaching it. But as always, we'll teach it alongside Black, Indigenous, and anti-imperialist scholarship from centuries of resistance to Western science, nation states, and colonization. In other words, that you mustn't lose the uncomfortable part. You mustn't lose the unsettling part. And it's a little, because the book's gentle, right? It's easy to not pay attention to that if you don't want to.
So the first time you read this book, or the first time you were working your way through it, what were some aspects of the book that really struck you, that really, called out to you, that made you want to keep reading?
Well, I was deeply moved by the way she talks about the natural world. I think probably one of the first things that I was really drawn in by was something you just talked about, the ways in which she is explicit about the ways in which you might know what is sometimes talked about in Mi'kmaqi thought as two-eyed seeing, a tapmuk. So the way Kimmerer talks about it is you see from a sort of a scientifically trained perspective through, Linnaeus's glasses, but then you also might know the world in another kind of way. And she talks about being taught about plants and the natural world by her father, right? So you're always seeing in two ways. You're always experiencing the world in two ways. And the way she captures the idea of like what it might mean to inhabit those two spaces, and she describes herself as doing that, it was what really brought me in. And then also just the ways in which she opens up the language of reciprocity and relationality in a way that is, as I said before, very gentle and very inviting and very welcoming. And I was super grateful for that. It really helped me make the first steps in understanding a little bit more about that. And then later I came to read more about the genealogy of ideas around reciprocity and relationality and how that varies in different kinds of the variety of indigenous perspectives on those issues and the ways in which they might play out. So she doesn't do all that work here, but she takes you by the hand and brings you in. And that was really terrific.
Yeah, I think one of the things that this book does best is introduce those kinds of ideas to people who don't know anything about them.
That's right.
And I am somebody who doesn't know anything about botany. I mean, I can't recognize one tree from another, etc. And so there are many things in this book that I was completely unfamiliar with. And a lot of those, as you say, are things that got me very excited, such as when the indigenous tales and knowledge met up with and complemented in very interesting ways the scientific nature. So there's the chapter on the three sisters, which I didn't know about before, and that maybe shows my ignorance. But the three sisters are three different crops that you would plant together in a way that would be unexpected to settler traditions of agriculture. And it is a corn, a bean, and a squash.
Yeah, and in contrast to this idea of monocultures where like this field is all this and that field is all this, instead the idea that they do better and they take care of one another. Again, relationality, right? They take care of one another in this intergrown setting.
Yeah, and you get a bunch of different reflections on how this works in the chapter on the three sisters. You get the artistic sense of it. You get the idea of this like tall corn and this flat squash on the ground and this bean that curls up around it and the sort of aesthetic joy of it. You get metaphors about how this is like three sisters in various families and how each has their own personality. You get a few other stories around how this crop came to be understood this way. And then you get a scientific explanation as to, why do these three things work so well together? Well, you've got this and that and the other thing. And I can't remember any of the details, I'll admit, but it was really compelling when I was reading it.
Yeah, here's a lovely passage, I think, that illustrates what you were just talking about, like the ways in which you get that sort of scientific technical language and then this other deeply affective way of talking about the natural world. So here, in indigenous agriculture, the practice is to modify the plants to fit the land. As a result, there are many varieties of corn domesticated by our ancestors, all adapted to grow in many different places. Modern agriculture, with its big engines and fossil fuels, took the opposite approach: modify the land to fit the plants, which are frighteningly similar clones. Once you know corn as a sister, it's hard to unknow it, but the long ranks of corn in the conventional field seem like a different being altogether. The relationships disappear and individuals are lost in anonymity. You can hardly recognize a beloved face lost in a uniform crowd. These acres are beautiful in their own way, but after the companionship of a three sisters garden, I wonder if they're lonely. So it's like this really interesting move, right? We're in this kind of abstract, technical kind of environment. And then like, I wonder if they're lonely, and she'll go back and forth between these two very different spaces with tremendous freedom and control.
And that's one of the fantastic things about the book. But, one of the limitations of the book is, as somebody who knew nothing of the three sisters and nothing of the stories behind it or the science behind it, I also walked away having no sense of, where the science comes from, or there's a few limited citations and discussions of people who have told these, versions of these stories. But I don't feel like I walk away knowing how this, I don't feel like I have any context of this story and of this practice outside of her.
This is one of the things that Zoe Todd draws attention to in that really interesting Twitter thread commenting on Braiding Sweetgrass, that the book is beautiful in all these ways, right? And yet you need to read other things too. And in fact, in a course that she taught in 2015, but then made publicly accessible for other people to read, she sort of lays out week by week a syllabus where Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass and Gathering Mosses are kind of the backbone readings for each week. But then there's a whole collection of other articles that both give a sense of the background of, various indigenous writers who are working in this space prior to Kimmerer and stuff that goes along and builds upon that work. So you can find exactly that kind of deeper level of engagement, especially around the environmental issues and scientific issues that you were just mentioning. So it's not taking away from Kimmerer's book, but it's like, and also.
When I'm thinking about that issue, I'm reminded a bit of Exile and Pride, which we read a few months ago, which was a collection of essays, and it was exploring a few different things, but, it was citing trans authors and so forth. And in the first edition, it hadn't cited enough, the author decided. And so the second edition went back and sort of inserted in footnotes without changing any of the original text, I don't think, but inserted a bunch of further citations to particularly focus on non-white theorists who had developed a lot of these ideas. And that was a much needed layer onto that text, I think. And I would love it if that happened to this book. I was so shocked that there were no end notes. I was so shocked that there wasn't a sense of like, where do you look next? There's just a very minimal bibliography at the end of the book.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I wonder, like, on the one hand, you could imagine something like what Eli Clare did for Exile and Pride happening here. But you could also imagine understanding this book as a particular way of telling the story at a particular time, right? 2013 is when this came out, right? And what it does is it makes you hungry as a reader, right? It makes you, or it should anyway, make you want to learn more and want to go a little further and, scratch that itch, right? To like, learn more. And that might be the right thing for it to do. In other words, I'm not sure that revising it and updating it is the right thing to do. I wonder if the right thing to do is say, yeah, it's the way to tell this story at that moment. And also you should read these other things and read these other writers and keep on moving forward. Like, I don't know, but it's an interesting question.
It is. And I don't want to take away from, again, how successful this book seems to be for many readers encountering these ideas for the first time and getting excited about them.
Yeah, I'm incredibly grateful for the book. Like I said, the book really was saying things that it was like I learned a lot and it put me onto other things, to read other things, but also like it really nourished me emotionally. And I'm really grateful for that, right? So like, I absolutely don't want to take it from this book. Like, I still really love it. But the dissatisfaction is like, it's like, like when you're little, you love your mom and you get older and then you're like, see everything that's wrong with her. It's a little like that, that. No, I mean, it's like, there's a little bit of that naive reading. You know what I mean? Like the books you read because they give you something and you're really grateful for it. Like, I read this book very slowly, which is interesting because I don't often read things that I like a lot very slowly. Like, I'll read something slowly because I'm finding it a slog, right? And only once in a while when I read something slowly because I really am getting something out of it and I want it to go on. And I did that with this book. And I talked to at least one other person who said the same thing about it, which is wonderful, right? Like, you don't want to not appreciate that.
Yeah. I mean, I do feel like this book really encourages you to read it slowly.
Absolutely.
And I had the problem of trying to read it for a deadline for this podcast. So I zipped through it a bit faster than I would have wanted to, but there's a lot of interesting things that might lead to that, including how sort of well structured each chapter is. That it starts out, it has a full arc, it comes to a close. They're all deeply satisfying, and it feels like a meal, let's say. When I finished each of the chapters, I didn't want to read more. I felt full. And that's a fantastic thing to do.
Yeah, and structured in, like, again, a very, I don't want to say oblique, what's the right word? A very kind of subtle way, where you look back and you're like, wow, that was really controlled. That was really short. But you don't feel it at the time. You just feel you're like in a bath or something.
Oh, yeah. It doesn't feel labored at all.
Not at all.
I mean, it feels worked or tended to, let's say, but it doesn't feel rough.
But, I think this quality of the essay is, how can I put it? I've been interested in sort of, like, I like essays a lot as a genre. And so I've read a fair amount of them. And it's been interesting to observe the ways in which the genre has kind of evolved in the last little while. And Kimmerer, I think, is somebody who's one of the people who's doing a beautiful job of kind of reinventing it or rethinking it or repacing it or doing something with it that has to do with what it feels like to read an essay. At least that's my sense of it. Like, I read a lot of essays and I'm like, oh, that's a good essay, but I don't feel like it's in a different speed, like where you actually feel like you're in a different rhythm of time kind of when you're reading it. And the only other time I had this experience when I was reading, I think not coincidentally, a collection of essays that was put together by Alyssa Washuta and Teresa Warburton. It's called Shapes of Native Nonfiction, came out in 2019. And a lot of the contributions there are beautifully written. It's a whole range of different writers. So it's a very different kind of collection from this one, which is by a single writer. But in their introduction, this beautiful introduction, it's called Exquisite Vessels. It too had that kind of relaxed and capacious and yet very subtly structured kind of shape. So I don't know if this is something that, if one read more essay writing by various indigenous writers, that would emerge as a kind of set of practices, or if it's something that's happening in essay writing more widely. And I just haven't read enough to have a sense of it. But I was really struck by that. Like, it's very different from like a lot of the essays I've read structurally and experientially.
I feel like we should talk about some of the other aspects of the book. And one that's particularly interesting is that she is trying to put forward a notion of what it might mean for non-Indigenous people to become Indigenous. And again, I don't know what the history of this idea is, but I can see that this idea is both very compelling and also potentially very problematic and divisive.
Totally. You put your finger on it. And I was interested that, one of the passages you brought out in this connection is one that's also been on my mind a lot. She used this very beautiful metaphor of the plantain plant. Did you want to read that passage? Because I think it really brings out exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think it also does a great job of showing some of the ways that this writing works. So she's talking about different species that have come to Turtle Island, to North America. And she says, our immigrant plant teachers offer a lot of different models for how not to make themselves welcome on a new continent. Garlic mustard poisons the soil so that native species will die. Tamarisk uses up all the water. Foreign invaders like loosestrife, kudzu, and cheatgrass have the colonizing habit of taking over others' homes and growing without regard to limits. But plantain is not like that. Its strategy was to be useful, to fit into small spaces, to coexist with others around the dooryard, to heal wounds. Plantain is so prevalent, so well integrated, that we think of it as native. It has earned the name bestowed by botanists for plants that have become our own. Plantain is not indigenous, but naturalized. This is the same term we use for the foreign-born when they become citizens in our country. They pledge to uphold the laws of the state. They might well uphold Nanabozho's original instructions, too.
Yeah, you were saying earlier that it's a very appealing, but it's also, you got to be really careful about that, right? What would it mean to be like the plantain?
And she admits as much, right? She says, against the backdrop of history, an invitation to settler society to become indigenous to a place feels like a free ticket to a housebreaking party.
Mm-hmm.
It could be read as an open invitation of what little is left. Mm-hmm. And I think that's absolutely fair, right? Mm-hmm. But it's also clear that part of what this book is an attempt to get settler peoples started down the path of
That's right.
thinking of themselves as indigenous / naturalized / however you want to think of it, but connected with the land.
That's it. I was just going to say that, like, what the invitation is to recognize your relationship to the land, right? That is, the land you live and work on is the land you have a relationship to. And that means it will be generous to you, but you also have to be generous to it. You have obligations to it, right? The particular land you live and work on, not just, Turtle Island at large, but wherever you are, that's where your obligations are. And everything flows out of that, right? And one of the other things that's happening in that passage, now I didn't even get it the first time I read it. It was only later, once I'd been reading a little bit more, in particular, been reading some indigenous writers who are sort of thinking about political philosophy and so on, being really emphatic about indigenous sovereignty. In other words, I first became aware of this when I was reading I'd been reading a little bit about reparations in the context of the legacy of slavery in North America. And I think I don't know, maybe one of my kids had asked me, is reparations something that's appropriate for indigenous people too? And so I was like, oh yeah. So I started reading a little bit more. And by and large, perspective on this is like, absolutely not. Because it's not about reparation for a thing that was done. It's about sovereignty and recognizing that the land needs to be returned. There needs to be some kind of acknowledgement of that wrongdoing and setting of that right. And there are political solutions that one could talk about at length that go with that. But indigeneity is not an identity, right? It's not that indigenous people are all the same. It's that it's said to be an analytic. People like Kim Tallbear write about this. It's an analytic, right? So it's a way of thinking about certain ways of being in the world, but it's not, it's not all one thing.
Right.
So here, when she's talking about what plantain might be, she's talking about, again, that kind of political system issue, right? You could be naturalized. You could become something like a citizen in our country. So you can't be, quote unquote, indigenous, right? You don't have that kind of relationship to this land if you're living on Turtle Island, right? If you're not from one of the historic nations that's from here, right? But you do have, whether you recognize it or not, a relationship to the land, and your obligations and privileges all flow out from that, right? And that's a different thing. And so that's a really good way to see the value of Kimmerer's writing, right? Because I didn't get that the first time I read it. First time I read it, I was like, oh, that's really nice. I'd love to be a plantain. and then I read it, I'm like, what does that mean, right? And so over time, when I was reading other people, I was like, oh, now I kind of understand what she's getting at in this incredibly gentle way. Right. She's giving it to you in a gentle, welcoming, open way. And it's actually much harder than that. But she's not going to tell you that right this minute because that's not the right thing for you to hear at that moment, right? When she's trying to bring you in the door.
So I found a lot of this book to be a fantasy. Creating a fantasy. And I don't mean that it's creating something that could never be true or something, but it's painting what it's describing in the best possible way. And it's trying to paint a picture of an end goal or a process anyways, that is something that you might aspire towards to make it as tempting and appealing as possible. Mm-hmm. And it sounds to me like that is somewhat also how you first heard it, right? You say, oh, I want to be a plantain. This sounds marvelous.
Mm-hmm. And it was immediately you're almost like, what would that mean, right?
Yeah. And if you start going down that path and actually engaging with it beyond what the book offers, it becomes completely more complicated.
Yeah.
But I did find it frustrating that more of the trickiness or the downsides or the difficulties of this weren't brought into the book. And to the point that it was kind of a turnoff for me. I kept feeling like I was being talked to by somebody who was only willing to paint fantastical pictures of the good side of things and not talk enough about the potential, what could happen? What if it turns out that you're trying to be plantain, but you end up being garlic mustard instead? That gets mentioned, but it's really we're going to focus on the plantain. That is all we're really going to talk about. I was thinking a bit also about Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, which again we read not too long ago, which also is a kind of fantasy in its way of what is it like to exist in a society where public sex amongst strangers is a thing, and what are the social benefits, what are the societal benefits of that lifestyle? And I feel like Delaney did a fantastic job of painting that fantasy picture, which comes out of a real lived experience and is not entirely, I'm not saying fictional, I'm just saying it's this idealized version of it at times. But also I felt like he really did a good job of also mentioning some of the potential downsides, some of the violence is inherent in it, some of the things that you put yourself at risk of if you go down this way. Maybe people have criticized him for not doing enough of that, and maybe that's just what I'm doing here, where it's I just wanted more. I wanted to know more times when this is not as idyllic as it's being described here.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's a book that, that's why I keep using words like gentle and open and capacious and welcoming. I think the book is so much doing that. And there's a value in that, right? That other things are not possible.
Yeah.
And that's why, I was really, and so I read her Gathering Moss later on. I read that book a little bit later on, even though she published it a little earlier. And that book does a little bit more of what you're describing. It is a little bit less gentle. It has some really interesting passages that kind of make it clear how high the stakes are and how dark the picture sometimes is.
That sounds really interesting. And maybe that book contains some of the language and conceptualization that I found missing here.
Yeah, I think you would enjoy it. So it came out in 2003, so it's a little bit older, and it covers some of the same kinds of issues. Like it's also engaging with this whole question of like the scientific world and then the kind of traditional knowledge that she brings from her Potawatomi background, right? And discussions of reciprocity and all this kind of stuff is there, right? But then she'll give you kind of, like I said, the slightly more dark side. There's this one essay in Gathering Moss. It's called The Owner. And it's about this one time. It's a sort of a narration of a particular episode where she was brought in as the specialist botanist because somebody is building a garden. The opening goes, "The letter had no return address. I'd been summoned by an invisible man with an offer I couldn't refuse. The letter on thick white paper requested my, quote, expert services as a bryologist, consult on an ecosystem restoration project, end quote. So she goes into this kind of collaborative working environment with gardeners and other kinds of landscapers. But it turns out that what's going on is it's a moss garden that's being built, but it's being built by taking away mosses from the places where they'd been previously and bringing them over into his backyard, basically. So it's a really graphic description. It's like rape of the landscape. I mean, it's a really graphic description. And then she says, to destroy a wild thing for pride seems a potent act of domination. Wildness cannot be collected and still remain wild. Its nature is lost the moment it is separated from its origins. By the very act of owning, the thing becomes an object, no longer itself. Blowing up a cliff to steal the mosses is a crime, but it's not against the law because he owns those rocks. It would be easy to call this abduction an act of vandalism, and yet this is also a man who imports a team of experts for the gentle wrapping of mossy rocks. The owner is a man who loves mosses and the exercise of power. I have no doubts of his sincerity in wishing to protect them from harm once they conform to his landscape design, but I think you cannot own a thing and love it at the same time. Right? That's the kind of stuff that happens in this book. And so, like, it's a little bit sharper on the edge. So you might like it.
Yeah, I might.
So, I mean, because of all it's saying, like, on the one hand, she's not just talking about mosses, right? She's talking about the whole way of being. You know, like, I read that and I was like, that's the opposite of the plantain story. It's where you imagine you're doing the right things and you're accommodating you're making a beautiful moss garden. What could be, more wonderful, right? But you're doing it at the cost of, it's extractive, right? That's a really important word here, right? It's extractive, like in a literal sense. He's having these mossy rocks dragged up onto his property and they keep dying off every time he moves them. That's why he needs her as a moss expert to help, right? But like it's an illusion of doing something positive in the world that's actually extractive and terrible, right? And so that's the downside of the plantain story, right? Like you could imagine you're being a plantain, but you're actually being extractive and doing exactly the wrong things, and you mustn't do that. So I found those two books together actually gave me much more than just the one by itself.
Huh. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
The other thing that I want to talk about, again, not wanting to like tear down the book too much, because there's quite a lot that's really good, and what's really good is in many ways more important than anything I've had problems with. But it was interesting to hear you talk about that you encountered it when you were, planting a garden, and that it sounds like it meshed with your way of life in some ways. There's also a lot of discussion of motherhood. Yeah.
It's very heteronormative.
It's super heteronormative. And this is entirely where I'm going, which is that I, as somebody who does not garden and does not enjoy that sort of thing, and who is not hetero at all, I didn't feel like I was being welcomed in the same way. And in fact, there are several encounters in the book with people who don't like nature, who aren't in love with nature the way that she is. And there is no solution for these people, to her, it feels like, unless you actually, you go out into nature and you learn to love the world the way she does. And I found that very frustrating. And there, there's some scenes where she goes out with college students that she's working with. And there's one guy who's like, oh, I need cell reception. I need my iPhone. And there's a few other stories. And she kind of just makes fun of them gently, or sometimes less gently. And yet either they, sort of end up agreeing, or we just trail off. That particular student, we kind of just trail off from. We don't hear from how he responds at the end of it. And I imagine it's because he's not fully won over.
Yeah. And I think actually it's a really important point in a couple of different ways. Like we could talk about that with regard to, non-indigenous readers who are put off by that. Right? But you could also talk about, and I would be curious to learn more about this. Like I know there's very robust urban indigenous communities that really think about what it means to live in those environments, right? And there's also in terms of gender identity and sexual identity, there's like a wide range of like perspectives, both based on different kinds of nation and tribal norms and practices, and also individual points of view, right? So there's like, it's not a question of like quote unquote authentic kind of indigenous perspective on this and it's I think way more complicated.
Exactly. And this feels like part of the problem of presenting this simplified sense of the scope of indigenous thought.
Totally.
Is that it doesn't account for other ways of being that don't fit in with this narrow idyllic narrative that or offering that or fantasy that she's presenting. I mean, and I realize that this is sort of my own fault. I should go look these people up. But like, I would love to know what this book would be like after having deeply thought about queer theories or, as you say, urban indigenous thought. Like, that's not something I've heard much about. And I don't know whether that's just not as appealing to the kind of audience that this book is appealing to.
Well, I think, I feel like this is something that we might want to keep thinking about. Like, you were calling back to Delaney's Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. And obviously that was that was an urban environment. This is about the land, right? It's a different, but there's some commonality in this whole question of how do you experience the physical environment, whether it's a natural environment or a built environment, and the beings that populate it, right? Which for Delaney are like the human beings he encounters, which are incredibly variable and heterogeneous. And then for Kimmerer, it's like all the beings, like the animal beings, the plant beings, like, there's different sets of beings kind of from what Delaney describes. But that whole question of like encountering a world and what it is to move through that world, that might be something that we want to come back to. Maybe if we can find an appropriate indigenous writer even who's like talking about that urban experience, that would be kind of neat. Because now we're thinking about like this is part of a cluster on land, right? This is a very particular view of land as the site of reciprocity, the site that works in one way for different indigenous peoples, different places, but also can be the ground on which settler people come into a relationship with the land and acknowledge it, right? So it's the basis of everything. You hear people sometimes say also like, language itself flows out of the land, right? And so there's a whole set of implications that flow out of recognizing where you stand, whose land you're on, what its history is, and what the obligations are that come with that.
No, absolutely. And I think it is unfair of me as a reader to expect this book to be all things. Yeah. And yet there is a sense when you walk away from this book that you've encountered the all things. It is perhaps too well written. It is perhaps too beautiful and too convincing in its argument that if you feel alienated from it in any way, it's going to hurt even more.
Yeah. I wonder if that's, like I was saying before, her Gathering Mosses, I wonder why that book, I'm wondering to what extent my ultimate reception of Braiding Sweetgrass, how important Gathering Mosses was for that. Because that feeling you're describing, for me, was really mitigated in a lot of ways. But when I read Gathering Moss, because I was like, oh, she doesn't have such a, clean and tidy and perfect view of the world. Like it's not that she doesn't see that. It's that she's not doing that in this book. So I found it was a really good chaser.
So I am glad to hear that you have done a lot of reading inspired by this book, that you've gone deeper into this line of thinking and thought. And I know that one of the ways that you've been doing this is by learning more about the indigenous cultures from around where you're living right now.
Yeah. Well, so this is one of the things that, is to some extent explicit in Kimmerer's writing. Some of it's implicit and some of it's explicit. This idea that wherever you are, there are a certain set of obligations that arise, right? And the obligations might involve, and Kimmerer is very interested in this, right? The natural world. What are the plants that grow? Right? What are the trees that grow? Where are the rivers? What is the history of the place you're in? And that involves the natural history, but also, whose land are you on? Who are the people? What is their history? Where are they now if they're not in the same place? Like all that stuff, right? So it's the natural world, it's the history, and also it might be the language that was spoken there. So like the pandemic has been terrible in a lot of ways, but one of the things that's been great is learning happens online in ways that weren't always the case. So language learning has been something in particular that's become possible. So where I live in New Jersey is historically Delaware or Lenape territory, right? And some of these communities are living as the Delaware Nation and tribe down in Oklahoma, some out in Wisconsin as the Stockbridge-Munsee community, others in Kansas, in southwestern Ontario as the Munsee Delaware Nation and Moravian Town. And then there's scattered communities that are also still in this general area, the Nanticoke Delawares and to the south, and then up north, the Ramapo Nation, right? So there's a lot to say about that history and how their history over time has changed how they see themselves relative to one another. There's a lot to say about that. But so language learning is happening online. And so there's some teachers up in the Munsee Nation up in southwestern Ontario have been teaching online, and I was lucky enough to join a class. And it's been so interesting and like transformative, like in all kinds of ways, because like, I've learned some different languages as a medievalist, right? You have to learn medieval vernaculars, you have to learn Latin, learn a little bit of, different languages, right? And this, I remember years ago when somebody said something about learning indigenous languages might be a good thing, I was like, wow, that's just crazy. I was like, what would you use that for? But now it's like, it gives you a totally different sense of how the history of the people as they are now in the world, how these things all fit together, right? And it sounds kind of like mystical and mumbo jumbo-ish when I describe it, but it just has given me such a different sense of how those things hang together and how having a sense of your own situation and where you are in the world affects how you relate to everything else around you. So that's been super positive. And so I've been learning Munsee language, which is one of the two dialects of Lenape. Munsee is sort of the northern dialect and Unami is the southern one. And that's a kind of oversimplification because people from speaking those two different dialects kind of ended up sometimes separately and sometimes together, but those are the main separations. And so, it's been really interesting. And especially like it's so differently structured in terms of like how verbs work, which is super complicated. And you don't have gender for the nouns, but instead you divide up nouns as animate or inanimate, which affects their endings. They're declined, like the nouns are declined. And then also you have to decline the adjectives that go with them. And also the verbs are affected by whether what you're talking about is animate or inanimate, whether the subject is animate or inanimate, or whether the object is animate or inanimate, or plural or singular. So it's like, whoa. And also like the pronouns, like you don't have pronouns, but instead you add prefixes, preverbs onto the verbs. I know it's a little inside baseball, but if you like languages, it's kind of fun. So when you're conjugating the verb to be we, it depends on if it's we, but not you that I'm talking to.
Right.
Or if it's all of us we, right?
Yeah.
And so the verb looks different depending on what's going on there. So it's just a very different way of structuring so many things. And so that's what I mean by saying the language gives you all this other stuff.
That's really fascinating. Kimmerer does talk about some of this in a chapter called Learning the Grammar of Animacy. And I'm a big grammar nerd. So I've encountered some of those things before in reading about languages, but I've never tried to learn, tried to think, tried to read, tried to express myself in a language that asked me to attend to all those different aspects of the world.
Yeah. She writes about this animate, inanimate thing in a lovely passage. Again, lovely writing, right? She says, European languages often assign gender to nouns, but Potawatomi does not divide the world into masculine and feminine. Nouns and verbs both are animate and inanimate. You hear a person with a word that is completely different from the one with which you hear an airplane. Pronouns, articles, plurals, demonstratives, verbs, all those syntactical bits I could never keep straight in high school English are all aligned in Potawatomi. Right? Different verb forms, different plurals, different everything, depending on whether what you are speaking of is alive. Actually, though, it doesn't really work that way. I mean, at least in Munsee, right? These are Algonquin languages, right? So they're structurally quite similar, even though they're distinct languages, right? Anishinaabe is also and Ojibwe is also, right? They're part of the same large language family. And it's not so much that animate, yes, people are animate and like an airplane is inanimate, but also if you look at fruits and vegetables, some of them are animate and some of them are inanimate.
Right.
And so it's not as simple as saying living things are animate and non-living things are inanimate. It varies a lot. So it's kind of cool. Potatoes are animate. Go figure.
It's interesting that, that one of the ways that she describes this is that European languages have gender and these languages don't. But my understanding is that linguistically, these are all considered gender. It's just gender in European languages sort of stems from this, lines up with this idea of male versus female versus neuter, or whatever, depending on the language. Whereas it's following different categories, animacy, inanimacy in the Algonquin languages. And just like how in French or German, there are going to be some words where you're like, wait, that's the gender for that? That doesn't make any sense. Like, it becomes arbitrary at a certain point. And that plays out as well as in all languages. There's a certain amount of arbitrariness, but that's really fascinating. Have you? I mean, I understand that, like, there's no way that you could become fluent in the language in this little amount of time. And I don't even know if that is your ultimate goal, but you described it as making you feel more connected to your place. But like, is there anything else that, trying to think in this language has done for you?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. There's a whole bunch of different things. So first I was learning like some nouns, and I was like really enchanted with the fact that I knew these nouns of things around me, right? So I'd go like literally be on a walk, I'd be like saying hello to the tree, because like I knew the word for it, and I saw some deer and I was like, Kuinganal atok, say hi to the deer, because I knew these words. And it was like really, it's just sort of enchanting, right? And as time went by, I became aware of other things. So for example, in the language class that I've been in, I mentioned that the Lenape people, in the different communities are kind of separated widely, right? And in that class, there are people who are from Ontario, from both Moraviantown and from other parts of Ontario. And then there's people from the New York, New Jersey area who are part down in Pennsylvania. Someone is down in Tennessee who's part of the Kansas community. Some people are part of the Wisconsin community. So there's also like a whole like being together kind of thing to it, so there's a lot that's just like, there's a lot of conversation that's not strictly speaking studying the language, but more like people, right? And thinking about things together. And, that's been really, really wonderful and interesting. And I think that community that's been developing in those online environments has been really important, I think, for the people that I've been getting to know, right? In terms of how that goes for these people who normally see each other like once a year, right? And then more recently, you get to a point where you learn enough to kind of have a sense of how much your teachers know. And our teachers are, there's one main teacher and then another person who supports her. They're wonderful and knowledgeable, and they carry a lot of knowledge that they've gotten from earlier teachers and so on. But it's not a community that has fluent speakers anymore, right? They have continuity of Munsee as a second language, but not as a first language. Like the people who still spoke as a first language no longer with us, right? Like recently, but like in the last little while. And so there's a real sense of communal responsibility around the language, right? So I had always kind of thought, oh, it'd be great. I'll do this for a few months. And then, I'll know a few words and like, that's something and that's enough. And now I'm like, well, not that I imagine I would ever get to be fluent, but like, are there things I can do that are helpful for other people? Can I learn enough where I can kind of generate some language study materials that help people who know less than I do, and like some of us in the class have been like studying with one another. And like, in other words, the idea that it's like it's community. It's not just like this passive thing that you go to class, you have a teacher, the teacher gives you some knowledge. Now you have your knowledge, but rather there's this collective kind of undertaking and you have a responsibility that comes with it. If somebody's given you knowledge, you have a responsibility that comes with that. Yeah.
There's a reciprocity.
That's it. Yeah. And so like, I had no idea about any of this when I started.
Well, that sounds marvelous.
Yeah, I know. So that's what I knew. I think it's been transformative. It's like really mind blowing in all unexpected ways.
Well, so that's Braiding Sweetgrass. If you haven't read it, even though, I said a few things against it, I guess, I absolutely recommend that you give it a try if any of this is new information for you and you're curious about reading it. It's a lovely book.
It is. It's really beautiful.
But now we're reached the end of the show, and so we're going to talk a little bit about what else we have been reading. Is there anything else that you've been reading, or just a book that you've read in the past that you've been thinking about lately?
Well, I have to confess, I've this and then getting ready for our next episode, I've been doing some rereading there. And the other thing I've been reading, and it's something I mentioned before, is Tom Porter's And Grandma Said, Iroquois Teachings, passed down through the oral tradition. I've been reading that, again, kind of slowly, because I've gotten really interested in books that are inhabiting that space between books that are written and things that have a kind of an oral status, like oracy, oratory. We read Lee Maricle's Memory Serves, which is written in a very particular kind of collaborative way to capture oratory, right?
Right.
So I've been spending time slowly reading things that are in that space. That's something I'd love to come back to together. What have you been reading?
Well, I wanted to talk about a book that I haven't been reading because it hasn't been published yet, but I wanted to, bring it to people's attention because I'm very excited about it. It's being crowdfunded right now, and I'll put a link in the show notes if anyone's interested. But it's a book that's called Judith. It's an anthology with the subtitle "Women Making Visual Poetry," edited by Amanda Earle, and I'm super excited about this. Visual poetry is sort of this liminal space between poetry and art, and there are many, 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 many different ways that it's been done before. This seems particularly interesting to me. The editor gathered about a dozen different women who are doing interesting work in visual poetry, and then asked them to name more women who inspired or influenced their work. And so it's going to become this like network, this mesh, this sort of starting out point of lines that you might go down for exploring this interesting field of work. And, you know, I'm a big fan of visual poetry. Part of my abandoned dissertation was going to be about that. And I am super curious to see how this comes out.
Wow.
Yeah.
When's it supposed to come out?
Well, they are planning on, you know, once the money's been raised, they're planning on getting it printed right away. So they're hoping to have it out by the end of May. It's a crowdfunded thing, so I imagine that means August, if not later, because that, and also, you know, it's difficult to publish books during pandemic. But either way, I can wait. It'll be good when it gets here.
That's great.
We also asked listeners to tell us about any books that they're reading that we might get excited by. And we got some good responses to that. Was there anything that particularly caught your eye?
Well, one of the things I noticed was that Steve Mintz had 2 suggestions for us, one of which, of course, I was totally wholehearted about. He said we should do Moby Dick again.
Well,
and I was like, every day. But so I don't know.
You may need a second podcast. That's all. Moby Dick.
Maybe not, you know. But he also mentioned Dion Brand's Map to the Door of No Return. And somebody else had recommended to me that I read something by Dion Brand. So I was curious about this, looked it up, and it was sold immediately because the cover's got this fantastic colonial map of Africa on it. So huge sucker for cartography. So that immediately drew me in. And it's a memoir. I was just like reading here from the description, drawing on cartography, travels, narratives of childhood in the Caribbean, journeys across the Canadian landscape, African ancestry, histories, politics, philosophies, and literature. Dion Brand sketches the shifting borders of home and nation, the connection to place in Canada and beyond. So like this whole idea of mapping to talk about the world, talk about geography, but also to talk about history and your place inside history. Like I love stuff like that. So actually I'm really eager to read this.
That sounds entirely up your alley.
It does, doesn't it?
I don't know if I've read any Dion Brand. I've got 1 or 2 of her books on my to read pile, but that to read pile is seemingly infinite. Well, I'll get to it at some point. Right? It is. I mean, it's nice to have options.
Better than the Converse.
Yeah, I suppose so. I wanted to highlight Anna Wilson said that she said, I finished reading Letters from Tove Jansson's Selected Letters. She's the author of the Moomin books and the artist of the Moomin cartoons, which are absolutely gorgeous and fabulous. And it's wonderful spending her time as a young artist, mixing with the art crowds in Paris and attending a series of art schools through her early 20s in Finland and wartime, a series of unconventional relationship arrangements with men and women in Bohemian Finnish art circles, the success of the Moomin series, and her attempts to build a series of more secluded island summer homes. Oh my word.
I was like, yay.
That sounds so good. It sounds really amazing. And she says, my favorite bit was that ghost was, or maybe is, slang for lesbian/sapphic in Finland. Or maybe that was just in her circles. So it's all about ghost parties this, ghost friends that. And that's such a good term.
Awesome.
Oh, I love it. I love it. I should really consider reading that. I need to read more Tove Jansson.
And also, I love letters. Like if you want to like do a cluster on letters, I'm all there for that. I love letters as genre.
Oh, man. All right. We'll give that a try. We'll give that a try at some point. So those were some of the suggestions we got. There were plenty more, and maybe we'll read some next time, or maybe you'll send some things in. We need more books, but also we want to acknowledge books that we don't have time to devote an entire episode to. Books are great. I think we can agree on that. Books are great.
Totally.
All right. Well, on that note,
our next book,
which you alluded to but didn't actually mention what it was, is going to be The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien.
I know. And that's going to be so trippy to discuss together. You know, it's one of those books that, you know, I've read it a million times books, but you read that comparatively recently, didn't you?
I read it last year for the first time.
Lordy, lordy. That's going to be fun. And again, thinking about the land, right? Like we talked about land in Kimmerer's writing, but we didn't talk about how that related to other ways of thinking about land. So I feel like when we get to Tolkien, that might be something that unfolds itself very naturally.
Listener, Suzanne is just trying to get you ready for an entire hour on Tom Bombadil.
He's so great. He's my favorite character.
Spoiler alert. All right. Well, in the meantime, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything that we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/43, and the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So, until next time,
see you again at the Spouter-Inn.